So the Supreme Court issued a major order in one of the most important Second Amendment preservation cases that we had going in the country. The court officially denied emergency review in a critical preservation challenge, which is a big setback. But this issue is not over yet, and what happens next may still determine whether a state's Second Amendment preservation protections can survive in some form or if they're going to go away completely. And now there's a new twist with this issue. The DOJ made promises to the Supreme Court about fixing this case, and so far they have not followed through with those promises. Because of that, the state lawmakers are now moving forward with a new version of this law on their own because they're tired of waiting for the DOJ to do their job. So let's break down what is now happening with this critical case and this issue. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also click the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that we've been talking about and following the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, also known as their SAPA law, and we've been covering this case for a while, and the multiple attempts that have been made to get the Supreme Court to step in on an emergency basis and actually issue some sort of emergency relief. This law was passed back in 2021, and it was Missouri's attempt to draw a constitutional line in the sand. The law says that Missouri's officers, agents, and resources cannot be used to help enforce federal gun laws that the state believes violates the Second Amendment. It also created a civil remedy allowing citizens and residents of Missouri to sue Missouri officials if they assist in enforcing those unconstitutional federal laws. In short, the SAPA law was designed to rely on the anti-commandeering doctrine and keep state resources out of federal gun control enforcement. Now, in response to this, the Biden administration immediately challenged the SAPA law in federal courts, and on review, a district court struck down the law entirely with an injunction. Missouri then decided to appeal up to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals and requested a stay, which was actually denied. Missouri then at that time sought emergency Supreme Court relief for the first time. The court, on review of that, denied the stay and issued an 8-1 vote against actually granting that emergency relief. In fact, only Justice Thomas was in favor of voting in favor of Missouri and keeping the SAPA law in place. Now, after that 8-1 order, the case went back down to the 8th Circuit, and there was expedited review of this case. And ultimately, once again, the 8th Circuit ruled in favor of the federal government, striking down the SAPA law completely. After that ruling on the merits, Missouri then decided to file a petition for a writ of cert, asking for the Supreme Court for the second time to grant review to this case on an emergency basis and rule in their favor. Now, here's where things started to go wrong for this case. The Supreme Court once again decided to deny review to this case, so they did not take up the Missouri SAPA challenge, and that denial is actually now final. The court declined to step in and resolve whether states can pass laws like the SAPA law to protect Second Amendment rights using the anti-commandeering doctrine. But things also got interesting when the Supreme Court was considering this case. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, the Trump administration had taken over, and while the Trump DOJ continued to argue that parts of the SAPA law were invalid, they made a critical concession to the Supreme Court. They told the Supreme Court that if review of this case was denied and the case returned to the lower court, the federal government would eventually agree to narrow the scope of the injunction that the Biden administration got. Specifically, they admitted that the lower court's ruling may have gone too far and improperly blocked applications of the SAPA law that merely involved non-enforcement, which is protected under the anti-commandeering doctrine. The DOJ told the court that they would acquiesce in narrowing the judgment once the jurisdiction returned back to the lower court. However, while this case was still pending, Missouri warned the Supreme Court about this exact scenario. They argued that the DOJ's concession was exactly why review in this case needed to be granted and not denied. They also expressed concerns that once review was actually denied by the Supreme Court, the federal government might not actually follow through on those promises. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court took the DOJ at its word and denied review to this case. And now here's the problem. Months after that was denied, and months after, and time has passed, the Trump DOJ has not moved to lift or narrow that total injunction against the SAPA law. That raises serious concerns about whether those promises will actually be honored or if the state was actually correct and the Trump DOJ just never actually was going to fulfill any of those promises. Now, because of that inaction, now Missouri lawmakers are taking matters into their own hands. This year's legislative session has seen a massive push for gun-related legislation, with dozens of bills actually being filed. And one of the biggest focuses has been actually bringing back the SAPA law, but in a new form. Lawmakers in Missouri are now introducing what is being called SAPA 2.0, but this version is a little bit different. The original SAPA law attempted to declare that certain federal gun laws were invalid within Missouri. That's ultimately why some of these lower courts struck down the SAPA law, the original version, because they said that you could not override federal laws. So now lawmakers are trying to fix that problem. Instead of declaring the federal laws invalid, the new version focuses on preventing state and local officials from enforcing those laws altogether. So in other words, federal laws will still exist, but Missouri officers would not be allowed to help to enforce them. This change is critical because it moves the law back towards the anti-commandeering doctrine, which the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld. So instead of trying to override the federal law entirely, Missouri is now trying to take a step back and say we're simply not going to participate in enforcing those laws. So where does this now leave us with this critical case in this issue? Well, the Supreme Court has once again declined to step in on a major Second Amendment preservation case. Missouri's original SAPA law remains blocked, at least for now. The federal government has publicly conceded that parts of that lower court ruling may actually have been overly broad, but at the same time, they have not taken any action to actually fix that like they said in the Supreme Court. They made a promise that they would try to narrow that judgment once this got back down to the lower court, but none of that has happened as of right now. And as a result of that, Missouri's lawmakers are moving forward with a new version of the SAPA law that attempts to stay within those constitutional limits and take another try at this type of issue. So it seems that the state is getting tired of waiting around for the administration to make good on that promise, and instead the legislator is now moving independently to pass the SAPA 2.0. So now you kind of have two parallel tracks with this issue. You still have that potential court case going. We'll see if the DOJ ever moves on that, but at the same time, the lawmakers are saying, well, we're not going to wait on this to happen. We're just going to take another crack at the SAPA law and pass a new version. So that's where things currently stand right now with the Missouri SAPA issue. Like I mentioned, the Supreme Court denied review of this case. The law currently remains blocked, at least for now, at least that original SAPA law. The DOJ, made that promise, but they have not followed through as of right now. And now Missouri is taking another attempt at passing a SAPA law. And this is just a different version, a new version, trying to tighten up some of that language, which, lower courts were critical of. And so they're just trying to change the language a little bit. So to fix those issues. So hopefully if this is challenged, it will still make it through that review. So this is going to be something that we're going to watch closely to see how this develops and if the DOJ actually ever fulfills that promise or if the state is going to have to go through the process once again on their own. So as we get more information, as this unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you guys like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.